It is on, and this program volume is all the way up, so you should be good.
It's good? Okay. I got to turn on my thing now. I got notes. Good afternoon. Is that good? Hello, my name is Phil Levin, and I am your host. Do you need the microphone, Andre? I am your host today from the School of Environmental and Forest Science, Phil Levin. So, it is indeed a great pleasure to introduce one of my Facebook friends today. I think it is one of the few times I've actually introduced a face, and I follow her on Twitter. She's in the top 1,000. So Angela is currently project director at the Pew Charitable Trust. She has an undergraduate degree. She went to Notre Dame. Then, here's the cool thing. It's in arts and biology. Then she went to Louisville, got a master's. Then she went to Penn, PhD, biology. She's educated. So I'm going through, and I found things that I thought were pretty cool. Before she was at Pew, she was a foreign affairs officer, which is pretty good at AAAS. She did a diplomacy fellowship at the U.S. Department of State's Office of Environmental Policy, which seems good. U.S. representative to United Nations Dams and Development Project. I mean, awesome. She's got fellowships like from Morris Udall, good. Earth Institute at Columbia University, impressive. But for me, not good enough. So you email the colleagues and you ask for, stuff. Like, can you tell me something that nobody knows that people really want to know? And most of the people said no, but this is what I got. I thought this was good. I mean, they were like, she single-handedly organized hundreds of organizations around the world into a learning network for how to do effective boundary spanning. Okay, hundreds. She's written seminal papers on how to effectively design research projects to most effectively link science and policy. Pretty good. She's really forced all of us to get out of our ivory towers and really think about linking policy and science and how to do that more effectively, really across the globe. Pretty good. Not good enough. Here's the two things I think that you should know. One, you can always tell when she's in a good mood because normally you would call her Angela, but if she responds to Angie, good mood. So try it out with the beer. You can do a before and after beer. Second, and this is little known, she has a disco ball in her basement, and you are welcome to the disco parties, which happen all the time. So we are lucky to have her. And with here is Angela.
Well, I feel like I should have started the talk with a slide of my basement disco ball, which is actually a big dilemma for us right now because I was telling a few folks here, we just renovated our house for the last 7 months. Actually moving back in this week while I'm here. Happy husband at home, trying to move 3 kids and a dog into a new house. But we got rid of the disco ball because we renovated the basement. So now we're trying to figure out how do you turn a suburban finished basement back into a dance floor. We're not sure yet. So we're gonna have to sort that out. It's one of the first jobs on the table. Thank you, Phil. And thanks to everyone who invited me here. Thanks, Tim and Phil and Julia. It's really exciting to be here. I've had a really wonderful day. It's been busy. I heard you guys keep your Bevan series lectures busy, and that was no joke. That was in a lot of meetings, but it's been really wonderful, and I feel like I've learned a lot more about sort of the depth of how you guys are thinking about how you connect your science and policy, which is, of course, what I really like to geek out on. And so I'm really happy to be here today talking about my work. So today, instead of giving this sort of usual research talk, I'm going to be talking about all these efforts that I've been sort of working on over the last few years to cultivate some what I would consider a more dynamic relationship with science and policy. Mostly to make sure that we're getting science into decision making about some of the issues that we care about. So I'm going to talk about this in 3 parts. One, I'm going to set this up, why we might be thinking about the science-policy interface in not always so productive ways, the problem of really complex social problems, and this is kind of why I got into this. What can we do about it? I'm going to talk about the Landfest Ocean Program, which is one of the programs I work on that some of you are familiar with here, and some lessons learned from sort of our muddling through of trying to connect science and policy. And then lastly, this effort I'm working on right now, which is building a community of practice about people who are in this in-between space, who may not be quite sure what to call themselves. Boundary spanners is a controversial term in some ways, but there is a practice there emerging, and I'm going to talk about some of the ways in which I think it's helpful to think about how we can join forces. So I'm going to start with a little background on sort of how I got into this, which is I was trained as a freshwater ecologist, but I was a freshwater ecologist who really wanted to be useful. I really wanted what I did to sort of matter. And I think a lot of researchers fall in that camp. I think a lot of us, not everybody, some people just want to do research for the sake of research, and that's great too, but a lot of people, especially who work in the environment, actually want their research to make a difference. And I thought a lot about that, and like most people, starting out in this, the way that I conceived of how I might have impact was to do some really, really cool research about the stuff that I loved, which was freshwater invertebrates. And of course, everyone would be as excited about how many chironomids were in a stream as I was, and somehow that would lead to some sort of change. And this is a pretty typical way of thinking about it. Oh, whoops. That there would be, that you would do some really cool research, you'd publish it, because that's what you do, and then this is called the loading dock model, you'd load it up onto the dock of somebody who could use it, a decision maker, and some sort of magic would happen, and all of a sudden they would do something different. Of course, a lot of you in the audience probably know that that's not necessarily that productive of a model. The way I learned that wasn't actually going to be the way things worked, or at least not very many instances, was when I went, Phil mentioned that I was a fellow at the State Department. I was a AAAS Science and Technology Fellow at the State Department, where they plop PhD level scientists into policy positions, and you become a policymaker for a while. And I basically became a negotiator. I negotiated international environmental agreements about a variety of things, most of which I didn't know very much about. It was not aquatic ecology. I worked on air pollution. I did work a little bit on dams, but I worked on a lot of issues. And what I discovered, and this is not surprising either, is it's really complicated. There's sort of a whole lot of there's a lot of conflicting evidence, there's a lot of conflicting values, there are a lot of perspectives, they're all interconnected. It's really messy. And if I thought that I was sort of making a good decision, even what I thought might be a good decision actually might have had bad ramifications for other issues. And this sort of, through this process, I sort of stumbled into this notion of wicked problems, which is this is a fancy name for just really complex social problems, which is what a lot of us deal with in the environment world. So just things that are not easily solved. So this is a complicated graphic, but the idea is that there's a lot of these problems are interconnected. One social issue, health, is connected to environment. There's a lot of stakeholders involved. They all have conflicting agendas. They're often multi-causal. There's every solution or problem ramifies through the system. It can take a long time to figure out what the solution is, and even if you find a solution, things may shift, and all of a sudden that's not the right one. So it's a really complicated world. And as I was discovering this problem I wasn't calling them wicked problems, this was later that I discovered there's a term for that. I was also discovering that I was making a lot of assumptions about how this world worked, not just that there was some sort of linearity to the process and the search for solutions, but that I was making all kinds of other assumptions. And first was that decision makers, people are actually ready to receive information. So that loading dock model, that someone was there waiting for it, and that they could actually understand what they were getting, or they even wanted it, or that was the thing that they needed in relation to something else. I was also assuming that the research that I had to provide was actually what they needed. That I was actually, my research question was the one that addressed the problem that they were having. Third assumption I was making is that I really wanted my science to get used. And I really wanted science to get used in general. I wanted science-based decision making. I wanted science to sort of be part of that, to be one of the most important parts of the decision-making process. What I wasn't counting on, which I learned quickly working as a decision maker, was that when I had a lot of scientists screaming at me, I didn't actually know who I should trust and who had information that I could use, and how to process that. It's actually, it's you know, scientists all think that they're credible and that they're value-free, but it turns out that's, you know, not necessarily the case. And the fourth, and this is sort of what leads me into the work I do now, is that if I can do the science, if I'm a reasonably smart person, I've done a PhD, I've looked at all kinds of complicated ecosystem stuff, like I could figure that out. Surely this other part is not that hard, right? Like it's mostly communications, isn't it? It's like talking about stuff and then, you know, something happens. Well, it turns out this middle part, the miracle occurs. I call it the black box too. Like there's actually a lot there. So this led me to a little bit of a personal quest to sort of get myself in a better place for thinking about this kind of stuff. And to actually be just sort of, I think what happens a lot is that people take off their scientist hat when it comes to the science policy interface and think that there's some sort of, like I said in the last slide, do-it-yourself aspect to this, or that you don't have to ask the same sort of critical questions you would ask in your research program as you ask of the work that you do at the science policy interface. And I found myself putting back that scientist hat on and saying, okay, so how would I go about solving this problem? And the first question I asked myself was, what is useful research? What do we know about what it means to have research that's useful? And this actually led me into a lot of social science research. And we do know something about what makes research useful. And there are some researchers who have looked at this and found that there are attributes of what makes knowledge or research useful. One is credibility, so you know how trustworthy it is. So in the scientific world, you know, we use the peer review process. We use publishing in journals as a measure of credibility. But also, and I alluded to this earlier, the relevance of the information, the saliency for the problem. So how well does it meet somebody's needs? The third attribute is legitimacy. So how trusted is that process by which the information was produced? And do people who are involved in the decision-making process, whether it's decision makers or stakeholders, do they view that as legitimate and fair? Did it consider a wide range of perspectives as it was produced? Why does this matter? Why should we start talking in jargon about useful research? Because these attributes and these concepts they all have to fit together. You can't just emphasize one over another if you're gonna aim for useful research. So as much as we like to emphasize the credibility of research and publishing, that research also has to be salient, and it also has to be produced in a way that's considered legitimate, or else it's less likely to be used. The second question, the big question to ask, is what does it actually mean to use research? So again, my early forays into this, I assumed using research meant policy change. And it turns out that's only sort of one aspect of using research. And again, this is some jargon, but it'll give you a sense of sort of the different ways in which we think about different kinds of use. And the first one is instrumental use. So actually using research or evidence or knowledge to sort of directly answer a problem. The second one is strategic use. You want to do something, you think you've kind of mostly got it there, you think it's a pretty good way to go, but you need some evidence or some knowledge to sort of support that. And this can be sometimes a not so productive thing if someone's trying to cherry pick evidence to sort of support their position. But it can also just be, hey, I really think I'm going along the right path, but I really just want to make sure. The third one is conceptual. Oh, keep using my clicker instead of the laser. So conceptual use is the use of knowledge or research to actually change the way you think about something. And this one was the one that I found sort of the most challenging and the most interesting. And again, sort of why should we care about whether there's different kinds of use, right? Like, okay, conceptual, instrumental, whatever. I just want my research to get used. Well, it matters because you go about developing research and understanding its use in different ways depending on what you're aiming for. So if you want to influence a discrete point, you'll address a specific question. If you want to change the way people think about something, then you might have to look more for the long-term gain. You're going to have to look for different markers of success. You're going to have to think about how do you measure whether someone's thinking about something differently. How do I know that? So this leads me as a natural segue into the last question, which is then how do we know that research has been used? If there are these different ways of using it, how do I actually figure that out? And this is a really complicated. I know a lot of people here. I've had some conversations today about this. This is a really tricky question. And I'll sort of highlight one really tricky aspect of this, which is yes, we'd like to think that, let's say, a decision maker and researchers sort of working together to make sure that the research is relevant, and they've engaged with the decision makers, so they think it's going to get considered in a process, and then eventually, right, they want some sort of policy change. The researcher, maybe. But what happens is this research can go into the thinking that the decision makers do. And they may be thinking about it, and they may consider it, and they may think some more, and then ultimately they do something else. This happens all the time, right? There's political processes, there's all kinds of reasons for not taking that up. But does that mean they didn't use it? That's the question, right? So if you're trying to get people to think about something and to think about something different, you can't necessarily rely on this end metric, which is a policy change. It's not actually telling you if you've gotten that into the system of people thinking about it. So hopefully by this time you're not completely either frustrated or depressed. But this is really what I think about. So taking account of all that complexity, how do you facilitate useful research that can get used in decision making? So hopefully we have evidence-informed decision making. So back to this trio of saliency, legitimacy, and credibility, we know that we need to maximize those things. And one of the best ways we know how to do that is to create a better dialogue, a better knowledge exchange between those who are producing knowledge and those who are using it. So it's not quite as simple as a two-way street, but keeping in mind that if we want to maximize those things, we're going to have to do a better job of creating a dialogue. One of the most common ways that this manifests itself is a spin on the model I introduced at the beginning, which is doing research and then doing a really good job of communicating it. So engaging with a lot of different people who might use the research. But what happens, back to one of my earlier points, what happens if that research at the beginning is not actually the research that all these people actually need or are interested in? So one of the other options is to shape the actual research idea using various perspectives and stakeholder and decision-making needs. And lots of terms for this. A lot of you know it as co-production. There are actually many, many ways of thinking about this. But the basic idea is actually backing all the way up and ensuring that the research question itself is the one that's most salient and relevant. can also, one of the other things that's growing in frequency now is engaging in the middle of the research project. So citizen science, getting people involved in the actual research project itself. But you can also engage with decision makers in the middle of the research process to sort of calibrate and make sure, hey, am I still answering the question that's most relevant for this group? You can also try to attempt to keep track of who needs what and when and how, and make sure that you're accounting for all of that. But this is where, you know, I look at that and I think, oh God, how do we do all that, right? And especially if you're a researcher with a full-time research agenda and lots of publishing to do, and your metric of success is getting publications out, how do we do all of this? How do we add that on to researchers' plates? So this is where my colleague Katie actually wants me to show the bat signal, to say that there's a solution here. So I went with a softer side of that. But this is where boundary spanners come in. This is really where the boundary spanning concept emerged, was to sort of step in and make that process of connecting all the producers and users of knowledge and creating that infrastructure for knowledge exchange as a thing in itself. So as a distinct practice. That previous slide, their job is to sort through all of this. And the way they do that is, boundary spanners, I'll get into this a little bit later, we're not like a one thing, but we attack this problem in a variety of ways. And one is making sure that we're doing really, really intensive scans of who's in the policy world, who's in the research world, who's yelling at whose research is about to come out, who needs what. That it's an intensive sort of policy analysis and review of what's going on in the research world. Doing a really good job of facilitating connections between those who produce research and those who use it. Finding ways to integrate those communities so that they're talking to each other in a productive way. Making sure, I referred to calibrating before, making sure that the process is actually adapting to shifting needs and shifting evidence, new evidence coming out as a process is going on. Translating, this is a big part of what boundary spanners do. It's what probably half of my team does, is spends all their time thinking about how do you actually translate stuff. And not just for like public audiences, but just how do you even translate between different communities and different individuals engaged in a knowledge exchange process. And then hopefully aiming at stabilizing that boundary so that, that instead of increasing conflict by putting lots of people together, that we're finding ways of drawing that conflict out and finding ways to talk about it so that the group moves forward. There are lots of us out there. I've heard even more today. This is a very, very small group of organizations that are engaged in some way in boundary spanning. It's very diverse. There's lots of different ways in which boundary spanners and boundary organizations look. Everything from individuals who work with researchers to connect them with policymakers to other university-based research institutes that are aimed at connecting knowledge producers and knowledge users. We're everywhere. I would love to have a really great collection of everyone's involved in this. Today I'm going to be talking about Landfest Ocean Program, which we discovered. We didn't call ourselves a boundary organization at the very beginning. I didn't even know that was a thing. As I was discovering wicked problems and what's useful research, this is when I discovered the concept of boundary spanners as well. And I think it was Kai Lee, who I don't know if any of you know, used to be at Packard, and we were talking to him about what we did, and he said, you know what you are. and so that led us to understanding what this world is. But I think across that variety of various organizations engaged in this, the common theme is that all those organizations and individuals engaged at that boundary in the space are all trying to be as reflective as possible about what it means to connect research and use, and to do it in as thoughtful and as a productive way as possible. So I'll spend the next few minutes giving you a sense of how we do this at the Lenfest Ocean Program, with the caveat that as I've discovered this world of boundary spanners, we are a bit unusual in that we are grant-making, we have a grant-making function and we have a boundary spanning function. But I think it's one of the reasons I really like thinking about our model is because we're a grant maker, we can actually we can experiment with lots of different parts of the process. So I will also say before we get into this that I want to emphasize that what a lot of boundary spanners and a lot of boundary organizations like Lenfest are aimed at is not necessarily changing policy. So back to this sort of different kinds of use, but informing policy. So informing the policy-making process, informing the decision-making process. And that's actually a very important distinction for us. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is just to give you a sense of what we cover. We cover a wide variety of geographies, from local fisheries issues in the US to EU fisheries issues to fisheries issues at the UN level. The idea is that we want to try to find opportunities to insert some projects that would be productive to connect science and policy. So this is a very complicated diagram. I'm going to walk through it in the next few slides. This is our process, and it actually even is more complicated than this. But what I'm going to try to do is explain it in terms of the broad functions that we try to play as boundary spanners and to connect science and policy and how we do it. So first thing to notice is that the Lenfest Ocean Program is sitting in this space between decision makers and stakeholders and the researchers. And this is not, we're not blocking them. So we're not saying you can't talk to each other. What we're trying to do is make sure that we're facilitating those interactions. So in many cases and in many parts of our process, decision makers and researchers are talking directly to each other. So I realized when I put this big red block in there that it looked like we were creating a big block. That's not the case. So we basically follow a couple of different steps in our project process, and most importantly, my watch does not like the microphone. We don't do a regular request for proposals process. That's not the kind of grant making we do. This is actually the really important to the boundary space. So the first step of our process is the staff of the Lenfest Ocean Program, which includes people with science, policy, communication expertise, doing what I referred to earlier as this really intensive scan. What are people thinking about in the fisheries world? What is some and what kind of research is going on out there that's emerging, that's already done and can be sort of inserted right into decision making? What do all those pieces look like? And we're always looking too. So it's like, what's the conflict? Who's upset with which research results? Who's fighting about research results? Who's fighting within the policy world? Which NGO is upset about what? We try to do that really, really intensive scan at the very beginning as we're developing project idea. And we're working, once we figure out sort of a rough idea, then we look for researchers who can sort of help fill that niche and do the project. And we work with them in the very beginning. I consider this part of the scanning process to figure out what engagement might look like in a project process, so that the research idea is being influenced by whatever decision-making context is out there, but also that we've set in place a project structure that allows that engagement to happen. Once the project is going on, the Lenfest Ocean Program staff, we let the researchers do their thing. It's not that we're sort of actively influencing the research, but we're trying to make sure that we facilitate any connections that might be helpful and encourage the researchers and decision makers, if they're involved in some sort of partnership, that we're making sure that all of that process and those research results are calibrating, so that we're making sure that all of a sudden the project doesn't veer off course, and all of a sudden the researchers decide, hey, I was supposed to do this thing, but wow, I'd really love to do this thing instead. It's really, really cool. And the role of the staff at that point are to say, hey, wait a minute, this is what's going on in policymaking, this is what's going in decision making. We really need to guide you back this way and make sure that you're answering that question. So it's a really important part in the middle of just making sure that all of that is happening. A third big component is that translation piece that I mentioned earlier, that even in the middle of the process, even in the middle of the research project, that there's some function for translating, especially if researchers and decision makers are talking directly with each other. There's often language barriers. There's often sort of different perspectives about what's happening. We make sure that the staff in this are working with everyone to make sure that that translation occurs. And then at the end of the project, we make sure that we're translating for different audiences. And while I have been adamant about the fact that a linear communication model doesn't necessarily work, we do disseminate results at the end of projects, because you can't involve everybody in a research project if you're trying to foster engagement. Sometimes people just can't get engaged for various institutional reasons. But there might be a lot of folks out there that might be very interested and find whatever came out of that project useful. And so we make sure that we've sort of amplified and disseminated what's happened in as productive a way as we can. And then finally, what we found, and this has been a more recent thing, well, we've always tracked what happened, who did what, when, how do we know, but we also have found more recently that it's helpful to follow the project afterwards to find out if there's any follow-up projects. Sometimes there are, and we're finding that out more. I talked about that already. So through this whole process, the LenFest team, the boundary spanning team, is always trying to keep in mind this sort of framework of relevance, credibility, and legitimacy, and keep that project on track to make sure that we're meeting those standards. So I'm going to give you a little bit, very short case study. And this is a homegrown one for you guys. Tim and Phil know this one well. They led this team. So this was a project a couple years ago on fishery ecosystem plan, operationalizing fishery ecosystem plans in the U.S. And I'm not going to go into the details of this. I'm going to try to give you an example of sort of how those functions that I just pointed out for the LenFest Ocean Program actually worked with this project. But basically, the idea, let me go back to this one first, was that to highlight the scanning function. So in this case, program officers within the LenFest Ocean Program were starting to hear that there were some challenges with operationalizing fishery ecosystem plans. There was a lot of variability in different regions of the US on sort of how far along different fishery councils were, and what kind of resources they had, how much guidance they had, how much they knew how to move forward. And this tells you how intensive the scanning process was. The team probably talked to more than 80 people about what the issue was and where we could create a project that could fit that. And so this is one where we couldn't just talk to 10 people and find out what the problem was. It had to be a really, really intensive scan. And the way the project was set up was, from the very beginning, was that there would be an expert research group who would think about how you would actually create a fishery like a blueprint for a fishery ecosystem plan that could be adapted for different fishery regions in the US. But they would be coupled with an expert group of resource managers and people who could actually use the research and who had some experience in creating fishery ecosystem plans or ecosystem-based fisheries management. And so those two groups would work together through the project cycle to make sure, to sort of fill this calibration function, to make sure that the research was actually still fitting the needs of the people who might use it, and to make sure that it could be adapted along the way. The second thing that this group did was to make sure that they were taking account of different specific regional needs. So the group met in 4 different regions in the US to make sure that they were accounting for all those different perspectives, all those different needs in terms of developing fishery ecosystem plans. So, so that the middle part of this project was a lot about that, the connection, calibrating, trying to figure out, are we still sort of getting, are we still creating something that people can use, and what are the different needs and how do we actually all meet them? And this is a funny picture because it's a photo, but it's been like, blurred out. I think that's, is that you? Yeah. I know, it's hard to tell. Anyway, so that's what this process looked like. There was this really, there's a structured engagement process to it. We also, at the end, did a little bit of Tim and Phil show, and we did a road show to make sure all those who might benefit from understanding what a blueprint for a fishery ecosystem plan might look like, so that they, that there were others that could take advantage of that and understand and learn how they might use it. And that last part turned out to be, so what? So we created, the project created a blueprint. It's called the Fishery Ecosystem Plan Loop. There's a way to adapt this for different needs, but what happened? Did all of a sudden the Fishery Ecosystem Plan blueprint get taken up wildly and everyone is now using this thing? No, not necessarily. But that's not what turned out to be the interesting thing. What we're finding instead is, so let's say this is the point at which the loop was created. What's really interesting is all this stuff that's happening afterwards, all the interest that we're seeing in understanding how different regions could take on this information. And the thing that people who express this interest to us, the thing that they make most explicit is that the reason that they're interested in is because they need a plan, but also because this group hasn't been forcing any sort of preset notion of how this should work. That they're providing a blueprint, and it's coming from a trusted source, and it's coming from a group that wants to help guide them, but not necessarily tell them what to do. And so that, back to this sort of like, what does use mean? This is the part that now we find this really interesting. I love that people are thinking about this and thinking about how they can use this in different ways. But boy, it really makes it challenging to understand what that means. I mean, so far, so we're lucky in that we're sort of, we're not beholden to a separate grant maker, but we want to know what we did and how we could do it better. And we're trying to figure out, so we know that there's this interest. We can document that and we can say that it's because this came from a trusted source, but how do we really talk about that in ways that people who are more used to sort of quantifiable metrics, how does that compare? So this is what sort of led me into a big chunk of what I'm thinking about now, which is sort of going back to this meta level of like, this working at the science policy interface is really, really interesting. It's really, really complicated. And we're starting to see evidence that some stuff is really cool, some stuff is working, but how do we really know how to get better at that? And how do we really know how to diagnose the need for this kind of work if it's really resource intensive? And that's led to all these questions. What do we get for this? So we get more people talking about it and requesting information. Well, is that a big deal? I don't know. How do we do it better? That's a big question for us. Why should we do this and not some other, why shouldn't we just invest all our time in communicating the science rather than building this complicated process of engagement? And is this a thing? Is this thing that we're doing in the boundary space? This is actually a thing. So back to the group of boundary spanners, it's just a small sample. What we figured out was the best way to start to figure out some of these questions is to start to share lessons learned and figure out how other people were doing this. We're struggling with this internally. Let's stop talking to just each other and start finding out how other people do it. And so I went out. That's when I started collecting people who are also doing this and finding out just how different they were. And it turns out there are a couple challenges there. One is there's a lot of parallel play going on. A lot of these boundary organizations have sort of cropped up independently. They're all doing their thing, but we're not really talking to each other about how we function. The second thing is it can be really hard to find these people and these organizations because of the way that boundary spanners work. They're in the background necessarily, right? They're trying to facilitate connections. They're trying to build that knowledge exchange infrastructure. They're not out in the front. They shouldn't be, because we want the researchers and the decision makers to be talking to each other. So because they're in the background, it's actually hard to find them. And there's not like a boundary spanners community. We're all in different sectors. We're in very different institutions. We're all over the place. So trying to find them is a challenge in itself. But you find a few and then you find more. So I started to collect these people and found a way to actually gather them at Pew. And over the last few years, I've been gathering people, turns out each year, to start to talk about some of these issues and compare lessons learned. And so this was the first meeting we had in February 2016 of about 50 boundary spanners who all came together to just say, who are we and do we actually even connect? We're doing, there was someone from the American Museum of Natural History there. There was folks from a really small boundary organization in New York. There was very, very diverse sets of people there. And what we wanted to do, though, is gather and figure out who are we and do we have anything to share with us, to share with each other. And the first thing we did was to start sort of compiling the case studies. Who are we? What does our institutional configuration look like? How do we do it? Why? And what happens? Some of the questions I've already been alluding to. And well, we have a long way to go in this. What we discovered is just simply by sort of gathering together and starting to talk about this, that we were starting to see patterns emerge that helped us understand sort of what we might get from doing these sorts of things. I mentioned in the Fishery Ecosystem Plan Task Force that this policy tale, or after the project ended, was a really rich and interesting place to be. And one of the ways to conceptualize that is thinking of new policy windows opening. So there was, a policy window is just an opportunity to inform policy, that actually, if we invested in those relationships early and we created a project process that had that engagement sort of baked in and set the stage for relationships to sort of continue afterwards, that new and different policy windows could open. And that actually was something that was common across the boundary organizations, that we were starting to see that. Many people were observing that that's what was happening. That we were seeing a more efficient tailoring process, that matching how research was, or what research was produced with what was needed, that because we had people in the middle who were doing those intensive scannings and creating those relationships, that process was more efficient. We weren't asking an individual scientist to go off and do all that by themselves. And that leads to, we were finding scientists expressing that they weren't so overextended. They weren't being expected to come up with sort of unrealistic metrics of impact for their work, that they were able to work with boundary spanning partners to help do that. And then one of the other things that we were finding was a common pattern, was that by working really closely with a lot of different groups who had a lot of different perspectives and values, that some of the conflict would emerge right away, but then people were sort of settled in and less likely to be upset with the process. And that's just sort of, that makes sense if you're building relationships that are trusted. Hopefully people sort of trust those relationships over time. So, that was really interesting. We were discovering sort of these patterns of what we might get out of this for doing this, investing in this boundary spanning work. But we were also, not surprisingly, and those of you who work in this space will find this too, that there were a lot of challenges for this group. Institutionally, it wasn't clear. First of all, we are at lots of different institutions, but institutional, both incentives and expectations for this kind of work didn't always match with what the work actually was. So those folks at academic institutions might still be expected to publish in sort of what are considered scientifically high impact journals, but really the work was about a different sort of thing and didn't lend itself well to that. So how do you measure that? funding structure. Again, we're a grant maker ourselves, so this is not necessarily a problem for us, but how do grant makers actually structure their funding to account for this sort of need, and how could we do a better job for that? How do we train for this? It's a lot of mindset sort of shifting. How do you think about your science role in policy, but how can we train for that? And then finally, and this is a big one, is sort of scaling up and out. How do we, the Land Trust Ocean Program model is a pretty small one when it comes down to it. How do you take something like that highly hands-on integrated process, and scale it up to something like the US Global Climate Change Research Program, which is like billions and billions of dollars, and many, many government agencies all trying to work together? How do you possibly, how can you scale that up? It's something that I think is a really interesting question, and something that this group really wants to think more about. So all these boundary spanners are sort of, continuing to do their own thing, but I think as a result of getting together, we also all felt sort of inspired to try to get more traction on some of this. And none of this stuff is easy to solve. It's not like all of a sudden we're going to change the way grants are given out and everyone's going to have their own, boundary spanner to like partner with them, right? That's not realistic. But as a result of some of these conversations with boundary spanners, there were some sort of small steps that people could take, including our own team. So in addition to working with the Land Trust Ocean Program, one of the things that we've been doing to try to infuse some of the lessons learned from Land Trust Ocean Program experience into the Pew Marine Fellows Program. And this is a program that Pew supports as a 3-year fellowship for mid-career conservation experts to do a project that has conservation impact. And it's a great group of people, all very accomplished, all really focused on impact. They all know how to do their work really, really well. But what we were finding as a common thread is that as they got to the impact part, there was a little more uncertainty about how you actually do that, which is not surprising. That's that hard. Back to this sort of this cartoon, there's a lot of, I'm going to do this really, really cool research, and then this miracle is going to occur, and then all this stuff is going to happen. So with really, really simple questions, we've been trying to sort of get those fellows to think a little bit differently about how they actually conceptualize that impact part. So to get them, I don't know how many of you guys have read the book, Don't Be Such a Scientist. Well, I totally agree, like, don't be such a scientist, but I also want scientists to think like a scientist when it comes to this thing, and not check their sort of structured critical thinking at the door, because when you do that, you lose a lot of good stuff and a lot of good thinking that could go on in this other part. And so all we've been doing with the Pew Fellows and this new crop of fellows is just working with them to ask these questions. Hey, if you're going to do this thing, you're going to build a website that has all this really cool data that you've just developed, and you want managers to use it. Well, hey, wait a minute. How do you know that that's what they need? How do you know that they're going to use it? How are you going to measure that? How are you going to know when you've actually had success? What do you consider success? So it's not crazy stuff. It's just sort of shifting that mindset to account for this sort of thinking about how you connect all these pieces together. So I think, this group, and yes, I mean, maybe we think we're a thing because we're depressed that we're not another thing and we need to be something, right? We have a little bit of an identity crisis. It's like, if I'm not a researcher, I mean, my kids are always like, Mom, you used to be like a real scientist. You used to like do stuff, and now you just think about how to do stuff more usefully. Like, that's not interesting, right? So, but I do think like it is important to sort of consider at least that this sort of expertise in the space between science and policy and social issues is an expertise in itself. And one of the questions, I just wanted to end with a few last thoughts. One of the questions I get asked a lot is, well, we've got all these other things. There's applied science, there's interdisciplinarity, there's science communication, there's advocacy. So why this thing? How is this different from all those other things? And what my answer to that is it's not necessarily, it doesn't have to replace any of that stuff. It's a partnership with all of that. Yes, we need science that's really focused on solving problems. Yes, we need natural scientists and social scientists to work more closely together if we're going to get better at that. Yes, we definitely need science communication. There is no doubt that is an integral part of all of this stuff. And if you really want to change policy, you actually need advocacy. So if that's what you're about, great. Go advocate for specific policy change. But at the same time, if you want to have some pieces come together, I also think you need boundary spanning as part of this mix. So with that, I was telling other people, my third grader told me I had to remind myself to see if any questions were in the audience. So I'll end there, and happy to take questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Angela. It was fantastic. So you had a path that was started off conventionally science, and then you ended up in this new space. And I wondered if you had a time machine when you were back in graduate school, undergrad. What sort of skills do you wish you had picked up back then that you think would be particularly helpful in this role?
Yeah, I mean, a couple things. One is I wished I'd learned how to facilitate people a lot earlier. That would have been really helpful. I sort of learned it on the fly in a way, but I think that's a really important skill. I wished I'd practiced non-scientific writing a lot earlier. It's something that I've worked hard since then, but it's a really, really important. I learned it really quickly at the State Department because I was expected to write memos on a moment's notice. But it's something that's really, really a big part of our work here, and it really gums up the system when we have slow writing. And I wish I would have, it's not necessarily a skill set, but I wish I would have, I did do a little bit of unconventional PhD committee where I had an economist and a lawyer on my PhD committee, but I wished, and I was telling someone this earlier, I wished I'd actually brought in a practitioner to be part of that too. I sort of stuck with the scientists of many flavors, but I wished I would have brought that in to really get a better sense of how that works. All right, thank you.
I'm desperate to ask you, rich people getting obsessed with the change, and then now their interest coming into the ocean. And a lot of research grant is coming more from philanthropy rather than government grant. Consider this as a risk, and if it is a risk, are you doing anything to hedge it against?
When you mean risk, do you mean that we're going to lose sort of momentum on government funding, and it's just going to be... Well, I think that, a lot of people talk about this too. There's no way that, Seattle private philanthropy could probably replace a big chunk of government money, but most private philanthropy can't replace the amount of money that's coming from the government. And so all we can do is sort of work in partnership. I mean, we are finding more interest from government folks in working with us on grant making, but we're really small potatoes compared to what the federal government can fund. And so I don't know that that's a risk so much. It's something we try to keep in mind. It's actually, we're getting a lot more project ideas as a result. But, I don't know what's gonna, I don't know what's gonna happen. I mean, I don't know. Wish I did. All right, I'll go. That's me.
Thank you for that. That was great. Pilkey's concept of the honest broker.
Yep.
So that's a role for a scientist, the way he describes it. So how do you think that fits with your kind of
Yeah.
role? I guess another way to put the question is, can scientists be boundary spanners?
Yeah, no, and it's a great question too, and I don't think there's one right answer. So I'd say I think boundary spanners, I didn't bring up Pilka's honest broker concept, but that is what we try to do as boundary spanners. We try to not push anything forward, not advocate for particular positions, but to sort of simply present, to help researchers present options for how decision makers might think about stuff. I do think that researchers can act as honest brokers. What I think is hard, and I don't have a good solution. Like I said, I don't have the cadre of boundary spanners who can all of a sudden be deployed and help everybody. But I do think it's a real challenge to be a full-time researcher and to sort of account for that complexity in a meaningful way. I think it's hard. I think it's not undoable, and it's certainly a lot of people do it. I just think it's a really hard charge, difficult charge. So let me work this way. Okay.
Yeah, so you mentioned, it kind of as follows, is that for a lot of researchers working at the policy interface, there's a lot of work that goes into that isn't necessarily recognized in
Yep.
other institutions.
Yep.
So do you know of boundary spanning that's happening, trying to make that work more legible at universities
Mhm.
Have you seen ways to expand in that direction? Or
Yeah, well, I mean, so I have seen, I know, I was telling other folks this, I think the Mitchell Center at the University of Maine has been sort of trying to take away some of the need to sort of have the same metrics of success that academics normally have, and make it about, is the group coming together to solve a problem, and are we actually making progress on solving the problem? But I think it's a really challenging question. I think that is a big institutional change that has to happen, and it's not an easy one. Because I think what's happening is we're shifting, what's happened is that researchers are still expected to publish a lot, and that's great, but there's sort of another metric in here, which is like how good are you a good communicator? And so then you can count like how many mentions did I get in X influential, newspaper or whatever, but that's also not capturing what this thing is. And so I don't think there's like a good answer yet. I mean, we're sort of, this is one of the reasons this boundary spanner group was trying to come up with like a sort of value proposition for how we're doing, and how, are we opening new policy windows, and can we somehow say that that's a thing that is a good metric of success? I don't know. It's not the same as publishing. That's the problem. So I think it's a big question. Okay, I'll work my way back there. Yeah.
Really appreciate your talk, and I guess my question, I'm curious if you have thoughts about this. If you could dream big and change the way that we do things,
Mm-hmm.
it seems to me one of the challenges that we have is that we've got very clear places where researchers work.
Mm-hmm.
We have very clear places where applied researchers work. We have very clear places where advocates work.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that there's a place where we boundary spanners actually work. And so to some extent, when people, I think partly because I hang out in scientific communities, a lot of times it sounds like we're saying, well, researchers should also do all the rest of this.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's an appropriate model, or if not, where do we put the boundary spanner?
Well, I think again, I hate to sound like I have no answers, but I think this is a big question, and this is one of the challenges with having sort of these boundary functions sort of crop up in many different kinds of institutional configurations, because of course what sort of caused those things to emerge is very different depending on what the need was and what the institution looks like. I do think there's places where boundary spanners sort of sit on their own. I mean, California Ocean Science Trust is one of those places. It was created by the state of California to create these partnerships and to be a boundary organization for the state of California and marine resources. So it's very specifically, it actually says boundary organization, in the language that created it. So I think there are places like that. The Luke Hoffman Institute is another place. Some of those folks that were co-authors with me on this, who planned that first meeting, all sit in spaces that are very specifically boundary organizations. So I think it's happening, but it's one of the things that I'm very interested in, sort of like, how do you diagnose the need for more of those, and where do you sit them, and what do they look like? And I think one of the more interesting and challenging places to think about this is within academic institutions, where sort of research conventions are really entrenched, and sort of how do you add that in? You can't, one of the things I find is boundary spanners who find me somehow and say, I'm the boundary spanner for this whole research institute. I'm expected to process everything in the policy world and feed it back into the researchers, and then feed all that stuff back out. And it's like, a funnel like that big, and you're trying to do that for everybody. So that's not necessarily a meaningful model. There's no way that person can actually do the things that would be helpful. But we're trying to understand that this is why I'm so interested in sort of compiling case studies about this, to try to understand what that looks like, and how we can sort of, if we wanted to grow that, if we wanted to get more traction, what could we do differently? So,
Yeah, I was just wondering what kind of requisites you need to become a boundary spanner.
Well, and again, there's like, we're not a like, boundary spanners of whatever. I don't know what our acronym would be. I need a good one. But I think it's this, like, I tell people it's sort of like half mindset, half skill set. It's sort of like having that sort of sensibility about, working with people in a way that you're not trying to like push your own agenda, but also this sort of ability to be, I mean, one of the biggest things I think that's helpful is being a real systems thinker. And this isn't this shouldn't be something that's a surprise to anybody who studies ecology, but being able to like understand how all these puzzle pieces fit together and how they're connecting and how you can move them around to understand them better. I think that, to me, that's why I actually like having ecologists come on board, because they already get that, they understand those dynamics. And but I think having that systems thinking with sort of I'm okay being in the background and not necessarily being sort of getting all the attention.
Well, it's time for the beer. But I just want to thank Angela again for really.
Yeah. How do you turn this off?
I got it.
Okay.